Okay, 23.3. So we just talked all about Hardy-Weinberg and about how it measures the allelic frequencies in a population when evolution is not happening. Remember the 5 requirements: large population size, no mutation, no natural selection, random mating, and no gene flow. So what we're going to talk about now is when those things are happening, when natural selection is occurring, when gene flow is happening, things like that. So these events will cause big changes in allelic frequencies. So this will really alter the amount of alleles in a population and cause a big change in the genotypes and phenotypes of the population. And there's 3 main factors that can bring about most evolutionary change. First one is natural selection, survival of the fittest. We talked about that a lot. The second one is genetic drift. And the third one is gene flow. We're going to talk about what these are. So natural selection is differential success in reproduction results in certain alleles being passed to the next generation in greater proportions. So let's talk about our flowers from last section. If the red flowers are more fit because they last for longer and can make more seeds, then those guys are going to survive, and the red allele is going to be passed on to the next generation, and the white allele is not. The white allele is those guys are all going to die before they can pass on their genes, so they are not likely to pass on their genes, so there's going to be fewer and fewer white alleles in the next population, or the next generation. So we're changing allelic frequencies through natural selection. So genetic drift. Genetic drift is an explanation of how allelic frequencies can change unpredictably from one generation to the next. And the likelihood of genetic drift having an effect on a smaller population is pretty large. So if there's fewer individuals, the likelihood that something is going to happen and it's going to have a big effect is much more likely. And often genetic drift can reduce genetic variation through loss of alleles. So these are random changes that can actually remove alleles from a population if they are all lost. Let me show you what that means. So here's our red and our white flowers again. You can see that the frequency of the red allele is 0.7, the frequency of the white allele is 0.3. So we would be able to use Hardy-Weinberg to predict how many we should have in the next population, the next generation, I'm sorry. But then let's say that 5 plants leave offspring. Now, because only these 5 did, for whatever reason, maybe the pink ones are more fit than the red and white ones. So that's why 3 of them survived to reproduce, whereas the red and the white ones only 1 each. Now our allelic frequencies are different. Our 0.7, we had 0.7 and 0.3 before, now we have 0.5 and 0.5. So our allelic frequencies have changed. Remember in Hardy-Weinberg, they would not change. So this is an example of natural selection. The pink ones were the most fit, so they survived the most out of anyone else to pass on their genes. And so now our allelic frequencies have changed because our population was so small. And then third generation, again, only 2 plants leave offspring for whatever reason. Let's say that all the other ones died because of a drought or who knows what happened. But only 2 of them leave offspring. Both the 2 that happen to leave offspring here are red. So now by the third generation, our entire population is red. We have completely lost the white allele. Completely. So that would be, now the red allele is fixed. So that's an example of natural selection causing big changes in the allelic frequencies of a population. So that's one example. That is basic genetic drift. And there's a couple of specific examples of genetic drift. One of them is called the founder effect. And the founder effect is when a few individuals kind of move to someplace new and start a new population. So they become isolated from a larger population. And so allele frequencies in the small founder population can be much different from those in the larger parent population because it happens at random. Oh, there's no picture of this. Okay, so let's say that a handful of seeds of the red and the white flowers get brought to a new island where they were never there before. But let's say that only 3 white seeds get brought for whatever reason, or 3 white seeds and 1 pink seed. Now suddenly our allelic frequency is much, much, much different than the original population. So the founder effect isolates just a few individuals at random and has them start an entire new population. So just the fact that we have a random assortment of alleles to start off with the new population is not going to be similar to the old population, or probably not. The allelic frequencies are probably going to be totally different. This is similar to the bottleneck effect. The bottleneck effect is a sudden reduction in population size due to a change in the environment. So for whatever reason, maybe there was a flood and it washed away all the flowers, or there was a flood and all the frogs died except for a handful. Whatever reason, some sort of event that reduced the population size drastically, and the resulting gene pool. So those individuals that survived and are now still part of the population. And then if this population stays small, then it's going to be even more suspect to genetic drift, like we were just talking about. So here's a picture of the bottleneck. So here's our original population. You can see it's mostly blue and white, a handful of yellows, but then only a few were able to survive, hence the bottleneck. And the few that were able to survive were mostly blue and one white. So now our population is going to be mostly blue with just a little bit of white. I don't know where this picture is. We've completely lost the yellow phenotype due to the bottleneck. So, sorry this is so blurry, I don't know what's happening. But basically, if we start to understand the bottleneck effect, we can start to see the effects that we are having on the environment. And the example that your textbook gives is the impact of genetic drift on the greater prairie chicken. Loss of prairie habitat caused a severe reduction in the population of the greater prairie chicken in Illinois. So we basically took away all of their habitat. And so by doing that, we really, really reduced their population, because only a handful were able to survive and only 50% of their eggs hatched. So it drastically changed the allelic frequencies of their population. Oh, there we go. So see how much area they had before in 1820, and then by 1993 they have those two little tiny dots. And so upon doing research on all these after this bottleneck effect, they saw that there was a ton of alleles lost at different loci. And so if we remove genetic variation, then we remove the ability to adapt to new situations. So genetic variation is really, really important. Okay, so effects of genetic drift, a summary. Genetic drift is significant in small populations, like we saw with those red and those white flowers, because if only a handful are surviving each generation, then, and it kind of is happening at random, then the allelic frequencies are going to change each generation. Genetic drift causes allele frequencies to change at random, so there's no prediction of what's going to happen. It's not like Hardy-Weinberg at all. It's not like natural selection where we can predict what's going to happen. And genetic drift can lead to a loss of genetic variation within populations. So like we saw with the bottleneck effect, suddenly we lost the white or the yellow phenotype, but we just as easily could have lost the white one also, and we would have been all blue, fixed for blue at that allele. And genetic drift can cause harmful alleles to become fixed. So sometimes there's alleles that are not beneficial to an organism, but they're there. And like the cancer-causing genes in humans. And if for whatever reason there was genetic drift and suddenly all humans were killed except for those who had the gene for cancer, suddenly every single human has the gene for cancer because it has become fixed, because we have a loss of genetic diversity due to genetic drift. And then lastly, we have gene flow. So we talked about natural selection, genetic drift, and now we have gene flow. So gene flow is the movement of alleles among populations. So we can really easily, remember populations don't normally breed, but they can definitely overlap and share alleles. And this can happen through the movement of fertile individuals. So if there's a cow that walks from one population to another population, suddenly we're mixing up those alleles because they're going to mate with each other. Or through gametes. So for example, pollen can be carried miles and miles and miles and miles. So that can really cause gene flow between two different populations of a plant. And then gene flow tends to reduce variation among populations over time. So if we're having a lot of gene flow between two populations, that means that those two populations are kind of becoming one population if they're breeding together that often. And so it's going to reduce the differences between the two of them because they're becoming one. And so gene flow can also reduce the fitness of a population, so the ability of a population to survive and reproduce. So the example that it gave are the great tit, which is a bird from Norway, and basically what's happening is they're still exchanging alleles with the individuals from the mainland, and because of that, they are not able to actually adapt to their surroundings. So if they weren't still exchanging alleles with the mainland, those who were most fit would survive, and the alleles that are not best adapted to the environment would be removed from the population. However, because new birds keep coming over, those alleles aren't leaving the population because they keep getting reintroduced. So this is an example of how gene flow could actually hurt a population because they want to adapt to their new environment, but for whatever reason, they keep getting the alleles that are not helping them adapt because of gene flow.